Welcome to Strategy Speaks, the official podcast of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. I'm your host, Daniel Fiott, and for this 7th episode of Strategy Speaks, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Linde Desmaele and Professor Louis Simón for discussion about the aftermath of the US presidential election. Linde is an assistant professor at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University, where among other topics, Linde focuses on US alliances and European security. And Linde is also a senior associate researcher at CSDS with us too. And then I'm also delighted to welcome Louis, who, as many of our listeners know, is the director of CSDS. And he's also currently running a really interesting European Research Council project looking at geopolitical relations between the US, Europe, and China. So welcome to you both, Linde and Louis.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here indeed.
Great. So as we've seen now, we've had a bit of time in Europe, at least, to come to terms with the election results in the US. I'm not sure how many stages of grief there are, but I think a few people are probably in the latter stages now of accepting what has gone on in the elections and also trying to think a bit more analytically through some of the repercussions and some of the shifts that might occur within US strategy, both towards Europe and also towards the Indo-Pacific too. So I'm very glad to have you both on this episode. And Linde, I'd really like to start with you, if possible, by just essentially getting your general impression on how European states in particular have viewed the election of President Donald Trump for his re-election, so back on the terrain again. And what do you think the Europeans have actually learned about the US, more generally speaking, following that election, if we've learned anything?
Hi, Daniel. First of all, thank you very much for having me. Very happy to be a guest on Strategy Speaks to have a discussion about the US election and what it means for Europe. Also with Louis, of course. So going to your question, my general impression is that there's been a little bit of variation in terms of the immediate reactions of various European leaders when it comes to Donald Trump's victory. And I actually think that this is an important point, this variation, and a point that we might want to circle back to. But the overall theme across Europe has been one of signaling a willingness to work with the incoming administration. But despite that, I do think we see a kind of a split emerging between those who want to signal that, above all, they want to somehow prevent US abandonment. So Donald Trump, of course, having on various occasions signaled that he might want to leave NATO, and at the very least that he might want to revisit the US footprint and the role of the United States in European security. So we have those in Europe who really want to prevent this from happening. But then on the other hand, there are those who focus more on the need to prepare for abandonment. So on kind of thinking that this will happen anyway and that the focus should be on preparing for it. And so in this first group of those kind of wanting to prevent US abandonment, I think we have the traditional Atlanticists, many in Central or in Eastern Europe, those leaders and governments who really strongly believe that their security, their prosperity are really best ensured through a strong partnership with the United States. And importantly, who seem to want to kind of preserve this even at an increased cost. So even if this implies that they will have to make important concessions to the US administration. And I think among these, they were very quick to congratulate Donald Trump on X, to signal their eagerness to work with him, and really trying to somehow get into the president-elect's good graces. So an example is the tweets from the Prime Minister of Latvia, who even in the very same tweet where she congratulated Donald Trump immediately added that Latvia spends over 3% on defense. So immediately signaling a willingness or an effort to get into the good graces of the incoming president. And interestingly, less on a geopolitical note, these traditional Atlanticists have also been joined or perhaps overtaken as the kind of more pro-US group by a number of far-right leaders in Europe. So we have Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, for example, kind of welcoming this victory, but more seen through the lens of shared nationalist, shared far-right ideals that they kind of share with the incoming US administration. But then on the other hand, as I alluded to, there are those who focus a bit more on the need to prepare rather than prevent US abandonment or some degree of US abandonment. And we've seen that not everybody has rushed to embrace Donald Trump. Some leaders taking a little bit more of a measured tone. French President Emmanuel Macron, of course, the key example in this regard, who immediately at the summit of the European political community in Budapest right after the elections kind of used his speech to emphasize, European sovereignty, signaling that Europe needs to stand more on its own feet. And other, European leaders, perhaps German Chancellor, the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, also a little bit more polite in their congratulations, but, more muted responses compared to the Atlanticists. So while it is, of course, still very soon, Donald Trump hasn't taken office, so it remains to be seen what precisely he will do and how these tendencies will further evolve and what that will mean for the security order in Europe. I think that this lens of seeking to prevent the US from going away or taking this as a starting point and, trying to fill the gap, if you will, I think that's kind of a useful lens for seeing how various European actors seem to be approaching the question of European security under a Donald Trump presidency.
Thanks, Linda. That's, I think, an excellent way into the introduction. And I very much appreciate what you said about variation between the different European states. And I think you also put rather interestingly your finger on the point that it's still early days, right? So Donald Trump doesn't even have his feet under the desk yet in the White House. And you pointed to the fact that we should probably expect that variation to continue and evolve as the weeks, months, and years hit Europe. You also mentioned as well in your opening remarks this really critical point, I think, about fears of abandonment or fears of how US strategy might shift more generally. Also, I guess, building or taking some kind of information from the campaign trail as well within the US about some of the intentions of the incoming US administration. And Lewis, the question that most Europeans are thinking about on the horizon is a potential future shift in Washington's approach to Ukraine as well. You've also, by the way, written with a good colleague of ours, Lotje Boswinkel, a really great piece on War on the Rocks, also kind of thinking a little bit through some of the consequences of a potential deal over Ukraine. But my question to you today is, first of all, how do you think Europeans are generally preparing themselves for a potential shift on the part of the US vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia?
Thanks, Daniel. I'm glad you asked me that question because, as you say, it allows me to plug the article that I've published with Lotte in War on the Rocks, which is entitled "Ukraine, Europe, and the Art of the Deal." And basically, what we do is discuss Europe's response options to a possible Trump-led peace deal for Ukraine. And let me, in any case, begin by saying that this is all highly speculative territory, because we really do not know whether there might be a serious shift in US-Ukraine policy, in the sense that events on the ground, and a lot has happened in the last few days, may end up altering Trump's plans. And we also don't know what kind of shift he has in mind. It's true that Trump has promised to end the war in Ukraine before being sworn in, although he also said at some point in 24 hours, which gives him like a 2.5 month window plus 24 hours if the 24 hours start the minute he's sworn in. We don't know about that. And it's true that he's also been quite consistent on that. Even though he has actually provided no details or very few details as to how he may do that. And I know that we've heard Vice President-elect Vance and other people from within Trump's orbit spill a few details in the last few days and weeks, but it all remains rather unclear, at least to me. And it's also true that any potential deal entailing some sort of trade between peace and territories would represent a significant reversal or departure from President Biden's promise to continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And it would also fly in the face of Europe's preference to continue to help Ukraine defend itself for as long as it takes. And that's the official policy of the European Union and of NATO as well. Basically, to go to the heart of your question, I think if we assume that Trump is determined to push for a peace deal, I think Europeans can do two things. And I don't know to what extent they are exclusive. The first is to try to stick to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes and to try to change Trump's mind. And if they fail to do that, to try to come up with a Eurocentric support infrastructure to keep the aid flowing. This could have a shot of succeeding if and only if I think the United States embraces it, even if it doesn't actively participate. But even in those circumstances, it would require a strong degree of European political leadership and determination. And they are both in short supply. And then, on the other hand, it would be almost impossible for Europeans to keep the support infrastructure going if Trump is against it. And then the second option is for Europeans to actually concentrate their energies, not so much on trying to prevent a peace deal from happening, and not so much on filling the void left by a hypothetical US decision to pull the plug on Ukraine aid, but to actually focus on trying to influence the contents, the details of a future peace deal. And specifically on ensuring that such a deal is as aligned as possible with European interests, which essentially, as I see it, boils down to minimizing territorial losses and securing as much of Ukraine's south as possible, but also, most importantly, ensuring that the deal is sustainable and it's not just a temporary ceasefire that allows Russia to just pause, go back to the gym, and then charge again 6 months down the line or 1 year down the line.
Excellent, Lewis. Thanks for taking us through some of the options that would be facing Europeans. And in fact, I liked your recalibration of the timing here. It's 24 hours plus 2 months. So I guess those 2 months will be rather busy indeed for European governments. And talking about European governments a bit more generally, I mean, I mentioned in response to Linde's first intervention here, that a lot has been said on the campaign trail, right? So we still have to play through and wait to see how much of the promises made during the campaign materialize into US policy. And of course, officials in the US are being appointed to some of these high posts. So they'll have the task of maybe implementing what was promised during the campaign. But I'm wondering here, Linde, if I could come to you and get also your impression about how you see this question of adaptation. So you said already that Europeans are thinking maybe through some of the consequences of potential abandonment, whatever that really means in practice. So I'd like to get from you, if possible, looking over the next 4 years under the new administration, how do you see Europeans adapting to that? Lewis gave us the impression that probably it wouldn't be so successful if they tried to fight some of the forces when it comes to Ukraine in particular. And I want to ask you, based on the next 4 years also, what do you think Europeans are actually learning from the first Trump presidency? Also, given that it was in a different context, also with COVID, but what have we learned from the first term of President Trump that can help us work through the next 4 years?
Yeah, I think it's always we always have to be very careful in drawing any particular lessons, as obviously the world looks very different today than it did in 2016, both in terms of security environment with, the 2022 invasion not having taken place yet, of course, when Trump was president during his first term, but also, important changes in US leadership, but also changes on the European side in leadership, also when it comes to the European Union, when it comes to NATO. So I think that context definitely matters. And so that we really need to be careful in drawing any kind of clear lessons. But I do think that what we're seeing today, that in contrast to 2016, when there was quite a lot of surprise and perhaps even shock in a lot of European capitals, that European leaders have kind of approached this election a little bit more calmly. But I think there's an important difference here between the economic front and security affairs. I think there seems to be a consensus that has kind of emerged on the economic front, where European leaders have learned. And here, when I say Europe, I should specify I'm speaking specifically about the European Union. They have learned the importance of preparation. In 2018, when Donald Trump imposed tariffs on EU steel and aluminum, Brussels was kind of caught off guard. It tried to retaliate, but it didn't really have a comprehensive plan ready to go. And now there's been a lot of reporting on the European Commission having a task force in place, really, that has been working for months on retaliatory measures to try to kind of bring the United States to the negotiating table as soon as possible if a trade war were to become a reality, which is something that Donald Trump on the campaign trail has threatened to do. So I think there's a shift in mindset there, with European leaders no longer waiting to see what happens, but more proactively preparing for potential challenges. But I think on the security front, the lessons are a little bit more complicated. Obviously, as I mentioned, the security situation has changed, but there's also not really a uniformly shared view on Trump's legacy in this regard, I think, in Europe, where, I mean, on the one hand, we all know how much he criticized NATO, how much he tried to push back against EU defense initiatives, such as the European Defense Fund, and I mean, how he definitely disrupted the alliance at the diplomatic level. But at the same time, it's also true that under the first Trump administration, the United States also strengthened its military presence in parts of Europe, and it actually maintained strong ties with certain individual countries like Poland. And I think that that might create a divide in Europe in terms of which lessons are being drawn, where certain countries, again, particularly in Eastern Europe, they actually might have relatively fond memories of Trump in this regard and kind of use the threat of facing a president who clearly does not like international institutions and multilateral organizations, to use this as an opportunity for them to build very strong bilateral relationships with the United States. I mean, I think there are important downsides to this approach as well, but I think that this is a lesson that some might be drawing, and others, again, particularly in Western Europe, coming to the conclusion that greater self-reliance is long overdue, and really trying to push more for a more Europe-centric defense arrangement, especially in the defense industrial realm. But I think that what we're for now have been seeing, and what we might see, and this is also what a lot of research suggests, is that policymakers and analysts very often just read history quite selectively to get the lessons they want, and that a lot of the positions that were already kind of in place in 2016 on the security front, I should say, a lot of countries are doubling down on them. There is some room of maneuver or room to change in the middle. But I think if we combine all of this, that we might end up with some more of a layered kind of where all kinds of minilateral, bilateral defense arrangements, both in terms of organization, but also on the defense industrial front, that we'll see a more layered structure emerge as each country kind of tries to maximize what it deems is the best bet from its individual point of view.
Thanks, Linde. Yeah, returning to that point about variation, also in terms of what lessons can be drawn, and indeed beyond the kind of usual media hysteria that we see, and through the commentariat as well, it's very important, I think, to dig a little bit deeper into each how each NATO ally and EU member state have indeed approached this. I think it's also very interesting what you say about the institutional dimension, and you name-checked already the EU, and you also referenced as well this point about self-reliance, which I guess also feeds into a little bit of the language now being widely used also in NATO circles about the so-called European pillar or Europeanization of NATO, whatever that means in practice. But the reality is that in any discussion and reflection upon what strategic implications may emerge from the US administration will also be the institutional dimension. And in particular, and here I'd like to turn to Lewis if possible, is to also get your take a little bit on how you see the incoming administration and President Trump looking at institutions, right, like NATO and also the EU. And then I kind of related to that point is whether or not you think these institutions are actually up to the challenge of these type of major shift in the direction of US strategy, and also some of the implications of what Linde was talking about, maybe about a more selective bilateral business case type relationship that might be struck up between the US and individual states. What's the future for these type of institutions?
Thank you, Daniel. I think. Well, I agree with most of what Linde has said. I think a lot of it will actually depend on what happens in Ukraine, because that has been and remains a top priority for NATO and the EU. So it's going to have implications that will trickle down into, I don't know if every aspect, but most aspects of the EU-US and NATO-US relationship. Now, on the EU front, of course, everyone is talking about tariffs and the specter of trade-related tensions. This is something that the EU must have been preparing for, and we already have some precedents. So it's more or less known territory, even though I agree with Linde that the context is different. Trump seems to have a particular fixation with Germany and with the German automobile sector in particular, which is actually the European automobile sector, because the supply chain is very much Europeanized, and there are facilities that are spread across many member states. And I think one thing to bear in mind here is that there has been quite an effort in the recent months to build some sort of European consensus on the question of European tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And I know it's a fragile consensus, but there it is. And I'm just not sure the European automobile sector can afford to wage a two-front war. So ironically, a Trump push against the European automobile sector may actually make the European consensus against Chinese EVs crumble. So just as the Trump administration or people within Trump's orbit insist on the need to establish clear priorities when it comes to security and defense policy and prioritizing between Europe and Asia and on figuring out which matters most, they may also need to prioritize in the area of trade policy and figure out which tariffs they care about the most. Particularly, they want to keep Europeans in line on all things China related. Now, when it comes to NATO, because I mean, Linde already spoke about European defense. When it comes to NATO, well, I think it's clear that I would at least expect some sort of headwinds on the question of defense spending, and I think there's a good chance that Trump may insist on raising the floor, which is currently at 2% of GDP, as you know. But I think this is good because, as Linde was saying, most European leaders will want to get in Trump's good graces, and Europeans actually need to spend more on defense because of Russia and because of the situation, security situation in Europe. So if Trump helps with that, then, well, thank you very much, Trump. And then I think there's also a risk that the alliance, that NATO may become less relevant, especially if the Trump administration prioritizes working bilaterally with selected European allies, which he might, and Linde has already touched on that too. And indeed, as she was saying, part of the risk here has to do with Europeans actually competing to become Trump's best friend, right? And on that point, the key question in my mind, well, I don't know if the key question, but certainly a very important question, which again, Linde has touched on, is whether the Trump administration or how seriously the Trump administration will take its bilateral defense relationship with Poland. And I think this is very important systemically because Poland has a central place in the context of NATO's deterrence strategy and the European security architecture more broadly. And I think the fact that Trump actually afforded priority to Poland during his first mandate is encouraging. You may remember that he had this plan to beef up significantly U.S. force posture in Poland. And I think that would actually be very positive for European security. That would be a very good move for European security. But I think we need to see what kind of relationship he's going to strike with the current Polish government, because ideologically is not as aligned with Trump as the previous one. So I think I would watch this space of the U.S.-Polish relationship.
Thanks indeed, Lewis. Yeah, and also reflecting a little bit on how what Linde was mentioning earlier about the variation between member states, but also how institutions like NATO and the EU are not only capable in their own rights of responding to any headwinds that may emerge from who sits in the White House, but also managing to keep some kind of cohesion amongst their members, right? So you both also rightfully pointed to the tension that will exist in many chancelleries across Europe between those two factors, the institutional bounding together versus what we do on our own vis-a-vis Donald Trump and the White House. So indeed, watch this space, I think, when it comes to those types of dynamics. And as has already been said by Lewis as well, I think it's quite clear that the first obvious test facing Europeans will be the question of Ukraine. And it's also very interesting to see, again, some of the major states in Europe positioning themselves already in that context, as we've seen in the last few weeks, especially from Berlin and some of the reactions from there. We didn't also touch in this discussion about the Indo-Pacific and how the Indo-Pacific relates to Europe. I think we'll probably need a whole other episode to discuss that. But let me at this point just thank Linde and Lewis for joining me for this 7th episode of Strategy Speaks. I think it was really rich. I'm also going to hold to our listeners a promise, which is that in the course of the next 4 years, we'll come back to Linde and Lewis also to get their assessment on how things are going, if we're still all around, of course. But thanks again for joining me, Linde and Lewis. And to our listeners, I hope you do join us for the next episode of Strategy Speaks. Thank you.